All right. So, welcome everybody. This is our November UBA Lunch and Learn. And today we are going to hear from Melissa Hills and Mark Wolansky from MacEwan University, and they're going to tell us a little bit about their work in designing some inclusive lab curriculum. So, I think that's going to be it for my introduction, and I'll turn it over to you guys.
Perfect. I'm going to start by talking about the work we've been doing with disabilities, and then Mark's going to kick in and talk more about like the implementation of the inclusive lab design that we're working on. So all of this work was done with undergraduate research assistants. So in this photo, there's myself, Lauren Tkalsic, and Sam Dancy. So they worked on this project last year, and then Emrys Michael is working with us now, and he's being co-supervised by Alexandria Kies, who is an assistant professor in our Department of Design. So to begin with, I just want to
Sorry,
acknowledge
Melissa.
that,
So
yeah,
you're not sharing your screen.
oh, I'm not.
No,
It
just
says I
letting you
am.
know.
Okay,
Oh,
let's try that one more.
I don't see it.
No, it's up for me.
Okay.
Oh,
Okay, never mind.
all
Okay,
right.
carry on.
I'm like, I don't want to not do that. Just to acknowledge that, I'm privileged along with everyone here. Well, not everyone, I guess people are from different parts of Alberta to live, learn, and teach in Treaty 6 territory, the traditional gathering place for many Indigenous people. And we honor and respect the history, languages, ceremonies, and culture of the First Nations, Métis, and Inuit who call this territory home. So for this presentation, I'm going to talk just a little bit of background about inclusion, experiential learning, and working with students with disabilities as partners, a little bit about how this project got started and what we did and what we learned together. And then again, as I mentioned, Mark is going to get into more of the implementation on the ground perspective of making a lab inclusive. So this is a quote from Gaudry and Lorenz. They say the university has normalized the experience of students who are white, cis male, heterosexual, middle to upper class, lacking disabilities, and without children. If a student deviates from these categories, they are more likely to experience oppressive obstructions in the completion of their degree. So we know that our courses are designed for someone. Design is never neutral. There's always a user in mind. And often we tend to design our courses for, the majority of students who are probably facing, maybe minimal barriers, or those things aren't necessarily things that we keep in mind or integrate into our course design. But the reality is that students are facing disproportionate and intersecting barriers to meeting the learning outcomes that we set for them. This can include disability, including mental health. It can be physical health, be it temporary or chronic medical conditions, their financial well-being, students with caretaking responsibilities, be it children or sometimes it's sick parents, or other people in their lives that they're responsible for, trauma, and many more. And I think more so sometimes we have students who might be facing none of these things at some point in their academic career, and then all of a sudden those circumstances can change. So the United Nations, their Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities really indicates that access to higher education is a fundamental human right, and that states should ensure that people with disabilities are able to access general tertiary education, vocational training, adult education, and lifelong learning without discrimination on an equal basis with others. And so, really, that it's our responsibility to ensure that we create the kinds of environments where people with disabilities can be successful in meeting those learning outcomes and achieving those goals. And I think furthermore, we're really aware of all of the benefits of attaining a higher education and not to have certain, areas or populations in our society to have access or equal access or equitable access to that higher education is problematic. So I've got New Zealand stats because I was in New Zealand giving this presentation, but even New Zealand, there are 34% of disabled people who are in post-secondary state that their needs for support for their learning are unmet. And people with disabilities are much less likely to have a postgraduate qualification, so only 7% versus 21% in the general population. And we see similar things in Canada. So a study from the University of Manitoba that was published in 2023 showed that despite universities' legal duty to accommodate students with disabilities, about 2/3 of the students that completed their survey indicated that their accommodation needs, so actually their formal accommodations where there's a legal duty, were still not being adequately met. And about 1/3 had been denied accommodation at some point. Universal design for learning is a framework, and it's a framework where you seek to design learning experiences that are proactively removing barriers that students encounter that impact their learning. So barriers to their ability to meet those learning outcomes. And with universal design for learning, it maintains the importance of our learning goals or learning outcomes. So again, the idea is not that you change the learning outcomes for some students or lower the bar at all. It's about making sure that you're providing students with enough flexibility that a diverse range of students can achieve those learning goals. And one of the main principles of that is like multiple means. So providing students with different ways to learn and different ways to demonstrate that learning. Now, experiential learning is something I'm quite interested in broadly, and this is an educational approach that is considered a high impact teaching and learning approach, where learners are physically kind of immersed in the subject that they're being studied or that's being studied. And so, of course, in science, this can include laboratory courses, it can include field placement, but broadly in a lot of disciplines, it can also include various work integrated learning, clinical and practicums, cooperative education, work placements, and internships. And so anytime we're placing students in these kinds of environments where, again, they're physically experiencing the subject being studied, where perhaps we don't have the same kind of control over what's going on in their learning environment, it poses unique challenges for inclusion. Now, students as partners is a widely recognized scholarly approach connected to the scholarship of teaching and learning. There's even, there's an international journal on students as partners research. There are international conferences that are focused specifically on students as partners. And so this was the approach that we've taken in designing our inclusive laboratory curriculum. Matthews in 2017 laid out 5 propositions for genuine students as partners practice. And so what she has, kind of described in her paper, that genuine students as partners practice should foster inclusive partnerships, that it should nurture power sharing relationships. So again, it's not about a faculty member telling the student what to do. It is really about you working together and both contributing as a team. It's important that you accept this as a process with uncertain outcomes, that you engage in ethical partnerships, and that you enact what you learn in the goal of transformation, of transforming, in this case, the learning environment. So this work was followed up by Ruth Healy, a recent paper in 2024, and I recommend it. It was a really good paper. And what she was pointing out is that the original paper by Matthews really was not approaching working with students from a social justice perspective, but she stated that really social justice is implicit in all of these proposals or propositions. And she aims to make it explicit. So she did an in-depth literature review that was looking at how faculty work with students as partners to achieve these kind of social justice aims. And it includes actively working to include and uplift marginalized voices, again, being really intentional in the ways that we develop these equitable power sharing relationships with students, recognizing that it's a process and it's uncertain, but also recognizing that that uncertainty might impact different members of that partnership differently. So again, faculty in a position of power might be more able to take on uncertainty than perhaps, student partners. That it's important that all partners receive benefit from the collaboration. So again, that students are partners and that there's benefits to them. It's not just, your research and your project. and that really working with partners, with students from marginalized groups or equity deserving groups is an active resistance to the traditional hierarchies in which it's staff that have the power over students. And this can be used to bring about meaningful and sustainable change. So this really kicked off in fall of 2022. We had a faculty member move to a different institution, and I took on Biology 205, which is a second year introductory molecular biology course called Principles of Molecular Biology. And so, in addition to, at the time, I taught most of the lecture sections, I was also assigned the lab coordination duty. I was fortunate that we have long-term tenured lab instructors, so there was a lot of support there, but there's 14 lab sections. It serves about 280 students a year, and I don't actually teach the lab, even though I was placed in a position of responsibility over the lab curriculum. And because of the way that this lab coordination had been assigned in the past, it had kind of been neglected because it was always kind of assigned to a tenured faculty member who didn't teach the lab, or it got shuffled around from one person to another. And so it's not pointing fingers, but it was the kind of thing where finding time to really invest in this lab had been difficult. And so we set about looking at that lab curriculum. So in April 2023, I recruited student partners, Sam and Lauren, and I specifically look for students who recently completed the course and students who are identified as disabled and or neurodivergent. So our goals were to conduct a lab curriculum redesign that used student feedback, but also used the Universal Design for Learning framework. And then the second objective really was to also examine this process of working together as partners on this project. And so I'm going to focus more on objective 2, and then again, Mark will speak more about the lab curriculum. So with objective 1, the redesign again, one of the things I made sure happened was that Lauren and Sam both conducted some training. So they got human research ethics training with their TCPS2 certificates, but they also enrolled in 2 CAST training opportunities where they got level 1 and level 2 certification in Universal Design for Learning. We conducted a student survey of all of the students who had taken Biology 205 that academic year to examine how they were learning, possible barriers to their learning. And then we did an audit and a redesign of the lab learning materials, as well as developing some supplemental learning resources. So the photo here is Lauren developing accessible short instructional videos for students that were posted on the Meskiness page to support their learning. So for objective 2, to really examine closely this process of working as partners, and again, this was my first, or again, I should mention that this was my first experience of working as partners with students on co-curricular development. I've certainly worked with students in various contexts before, but this co-curricular development as partners was new to me. So I wanted to kind of learn from that first attempt and understand it more. So what we did is that when the project was finished, we each independently wrote down a reflection of our own experience of the process of working together of the project. We examined things that we thought were strengths in the way that we worked together, as well as for ways that maybe it could have been improved. And then what we did is we set a date where we each individually again read and reflected on each other's reflections. And a week after reading and reflecting on each other's reflections, we scheduled a semi-structured discussion where we came together to talk about our experiences and talk about those reflections. And we recorded this for transcription. And then those written reflections and the transcript of the discussion, I went through and underwent a qualitative thematic analysis of those results. So these were the main themes that emerged from that analysis of our reflections and discussion. So the themes that emerged were vulnerability, frustration, connection, and also that students with disabilities are experts. So for the first theme, vulnerability, working together on this project, all of us felt vulnerable at times. And I think that going through this work also made us more aware of our own vulnerability as learners with learning differences and disabilities. So these are all going to be quotes from Lauren and Sam. So this is one from Lauren. She said, in the beginning, you're scared, a little bit of like hesitation. Like, I really want to make sure I do everything right. But after time, it started to feel a lot more comfortable. And I think this was interesting. I knew Sam and Lauren from previous classes. And again, like when we started, I felt like in our initial meetings, I took a lot of time to say to them, like, this is new to me. We'll do what we can do, but no pressure. It can be flexible. And put their minds at ease. And it's just a reminder that no matter how hard you try to be approachable and nice and, you know, that there's still that power imbalance. They were still concerned about letting me down or not doing a good job. And that's certainly something to be aware of when we're entering these kinds of partnerships. And then a quote from Sam who says, I think generally having a disability puts you in a vulnerable place in society. And so it makes it almost harder to be vulnerable, you know, instinctually. But it also makes opportunities where being vulnerable is really, really important for connecting with other people with disabilities. And so, again, I think just this awareness about being a learner with a disability and the vulnerability it takes for these students to have to constantly kind of share this information with their instructors, advocate for themselves, other themselves can be, I think, really exhausting to have to be vulnerable in that way. Frustration was another theme. So we experienced frustration at times working on this project. And again, I think that that is common when you set out on an ambitious project with tight timelines. But it also then connected to reflections that we all had on the frustrations associated with being a learner with a disability. So, you know, Lauren was like, I think my biggest challenge and frustration was getting feedback from other faculty members. And again, that's not at all a reflection on those faculty members. This work was going on during summer, so it was hard to kind of align schedules. But she said, you know, I found it frustrating. Some faculty members said they'd be available and then didn't respond. And so, again, part of that challenge is just workload for everybody and timing. And then with Sam, she said, you both in different spots brought up feelings of frustration, both in terms of collaborating and previous lab experiences. And Sam says, disability it's just like a lot of frustration. And I think this work to co-design this inclusive lab curriculum is really trying to reduce some of that frustration that people with disabilities are kind of constantly dealing with. And again, back to Lauren, she said, I think for both of this project made us so aware of the barriers that exist in classes. I wouldn't have thought of that stuff beforehand, but I think it's one thing we had a very similar experience coming out of, that we both just recognize the need for universal design for learning everywhere now. Before I would have been frustrated, but now I know why I'm frustrated. So they also spoke about this awakening where before they would be like, why is this so confusing for me? Why is this taking so long for me? And I think there was a bit of a tendency to think that the problem was them. When really a lot of times those barriers were created by the way that the labs they had been in had been designed. Connection also came up in all of our reflections. So connection matters. And really, we would have liked more opportunity for connection and collaboration. We really did a lot of divide and conquer. It was summer, so we tended to kind of meet online. But we also reflected on how being a student with a disability can cause feelings of disconnection with peers or professors. So again, Sam points out that we understood why we had to do the divide and conquer approach, but we would have liked to have more time actually collaborating. And I know that's a consequence of doing something summer. I was dealing with moving and all the other life things, but I think for me, a reminder that even if you are doing kind of a more divide and conquer approach, that it is important to carve out times where you're all working together and coming together. Lauren points out that as a student with accommodations, I find it very hard to make friends with people because I'm like, oh, well, I'm out there for an exam. And they're like, well, where were you? And I don't really want to have to tell you that I have accommodations and then get interrogated. So both of them again are pointing out, like, as a student with disability, it's uncomfortable to have to go write your exam somewhere else and then you walk into the lab late and everybody's wondering why you didn't write the quiz with the rest of the class, and that can create a real barrier between you and your peers. The final theme, students with disabilities are experts in the design of inclusive curriculum, and I feel this so strongly. It was incredible how much Lauren and Sam had to contribute to this work. The fact that they had recently had experience taking this lab, along with all of their lived experiences as being learners with disabilities, really contributed to creating an inclusive curriculum that I could never have achieved on my own. And so here, again, Lauren saying, I know my contributions were driven by my disability because I was always thought, how can I make this perfectly clear to help a confused and anxious student feel better about going into the lab? And Sam said, one of the biggest things about this project is how I kind of walk away from it. And now when I go into another class, I'm like, that needs to be fixed. That needs to be fixed. How these other classes are just not inclusive. And I think both of us share that. And so they really did have such an expert understanding of what the barriers were to students and how we could make these fairly straightforward changes in the curriculum that could really reduce those barriers. So coming out of this, I think as far as recommendations might go for anybody who might be working with students with disabilities as partners in the co-creation of inclusive curriculum, I mean, the first one would be to do it. It was a wonderful experience, and I would strongly encourage anybody who's thinking about doing some curriculum revisions or redesigns to consider working with students as partners. Again, I think that, all of us reflected that it would have been good. This conversation at the end was so powerful that we all felt we should have done it at the beginning as well. We should have started our partnership with a real open discussion about vulnerability and disability and our shared goals. And so that's something certainly I would make time to do next time. The importance of balancing structure with flexibility. So I tried to create a really flexible environment for them because it was summer and they were both dealing with a lot of other things. But I think there also has to be more structure in terms of carving out regular time for in-person collaboration. I think it's really important to provide students in these contexts with an opportunity to learn. So they get some training, they get some leadership opportunities. And this exit reflection and discussion that we had, I think, was very, very helpful for all of us. And so another thing I'd recommend. So I think this is where I'm going to turn it over to Mark, because now we're moving into more of the implementation phase. So I'm going to shift this over and start sharing the materials that Mark had a couple labs. So let me just figure out how to do that.
Yeah, I'll just start talking while you do it. I'm going to take a bit. So thanks, Melissa. So just to kind of give everyone some perspective on how I kind of fit into all that work that Melissa's done, because she's been a big driver of this, is about 18 months ago, I arrived here at MacEwan, and I am now the lab coordinator of this course, this molecular biology course. And so I am trying to work out and integrate into the structure that Melissa has set up. And so when I arrived, I was told that, there's a lab project and the course works such that the students kind of follow a project along the whole way throughout the term. And there was some issues with that project, and Melissa's kind of hinted that a bunch of work needed to be done on the project and the lab itself, and creating labs that are more accessible, more universally accessible to students. And so Melissa had some ideas for moving forward, and she had some ideas about how that protocol and that project might look. There were some other issues with the project, not just kind of design and accessibility type issues. There was other issues. So basically over the year, what ended up happening is we redesigned the entire molecular biology lab so that there's kind of a whole new project starting this fall. And it wasn't that much work. I'm kind of making it seem like there's way more work there than actually is, because we have a lot of similar structures. But how that looked is, and as Melissa had pointed out, lots of students contributed to this work. So kind of throughout the fall and winter last year. We had a student kind of testing a bunch of activities and protocols that we wanted to use in our new design, and the new protocols, or the new approach for the Biology 205 labs. And then once those activities were tested, we got together kind of as a team and we kind of started looking at the content in those activities and structuring them and slotting that into labs. We tested those labs to make sure they would kind of run through as we thought they would work, so that we think the students are doing certain activities in certain weeks and they're getting kind of the outcomes that we think they should get. Because this is a term-long project, we kind of need it to all flow along. And then on top of that, what we did was, after we tested and kind of knew what we wanted and where we wanted to do things, I took the lead on drafting, and Melissa's going to kind of scroll through some stuff here and I'll point out some stuff, but I took the lead on drafting some protocols. And my protocols that I drafted looked more like what's on the left side of your screen there. So that's kind of a more traditional view of what maybe a lab might look like. And we took those protocols, and really what the focus from my perspective was on those draft protocols was making sure they kind of told the students in words what we needed to do. But we know that that's not enough. That's not delivering it in multiple means, and it's just a wall of text at this point. And so we were very fortunate to have another student involved in the project, and they were a design student that Melissa collaborates with. And so we would send off these protocols to the student, and they would generate more accessible protocols. So as you can see on the right side there, this is kind of how they'd come back. And there's a little back and forth there, just tweaking some of that design. But for the most part, what came back is what we have in the lab manual. And so as Melissa's kind of scrolling through those things, I'm going to kind of note a few elements that I picked up on things that we, at least from this perspective of a lab manual being accessible, and more accessible to everyone, some of the things that we have. So the very first thing you kind of notice is that these protocols are on this gray background. So that's kind of to reduce contrast. It makes it kind of easier to see and visualize. So that's one of the big things that we've done with the protocols that have this updated formatting. And then there's a lot of little formatting things in there. So spacing, it's at least 2.0 all the time. The font, it's an open dyslexic font. It's supposed to be easier and more accessible for a broader range of individuals. Little things like formatting of the written text. So we're always using like sentence case. We're avoiding like all caps. And then there are very specific ways we use emphasis, but we're not, spreading emphasis all around. So usually emphasis is just bolded with asterisks on the side, just to kind of keep that more visually accessible. In terms of hierarchy, I don't think the one that we're showing here doesn't have all, but we've kept it to only 3 levels of hierarchy to kind of reduce some of that complexity. There's a lot of space, you'll notice. So that space makes it easier to digest the content. It allows some space for students to put notes and interact with that material. And then the big one that you can see is we were very privileged to have a bunch of these diagrams added in. And so these diagrams were rendered for us, and they're based on equipment that we have and the things that we do. And there's a lot of design features that I don't really have the expertise to get into with that, but those elements are in there to make it kind of simple, but to show visually kind of what is happening at each step. And then I think and so that's kind of one of the main areas that we've been focusing on, at least since I've got here, or that's been my kind of role to ensure that lab manual is accessible. We offer that lab manual in 2 different kind of formats. So the students can buy it, purchase a hard copy, and it looks the same. We have those pages, that gray background on those pages, or the students can grab that as a digital copy and then use it on any device that they can bring to lab. We do require them to bring the lab manual to the labs in some format, but they can choose. And then the kind of the last thing with the lab manual is kind of consistency, standardizing of that format. So the students have an expectation of what it's going to look like each week, so they don't have to rethink and redevelop what's happening every week. There's a consistent pattern of what their expectation is, and it's in this format. So we've done this as a test run, and this is Melissa's work. I'm just a happy partner here, but we've test run this protocol for 3 of our labs, and we kind of have a comparison going on right now. And so we're getting some feedback now that we'll be able to look at later on and see what's working and what we can keep or what we can tweak to kind of make it a little more accessible or make it better for students and get that feedback from them. So that's kind of on the lab manual front. The other thing that like I said, I don't have any visuals, but the other thing that I've been working on too is assessments. And I'm not going to go into a ton of detail, but I put some effort into creating assessments for biology, for the lab specifically. And I think this is a really challenging place to work in, or at least I find it challenging because maybe the backdrop is I think is that we should be providing students multiple means of communicating what they understand. And I think that works to a certain extent, but at the same time, as Melissa pointed out, we can't be changing the end metrics. Right? We have to be providing assessments that work for all students. And so how I've kind of thought about this is trying to kind of work from a model when I'm making assessments that this is kind of moving from like a workplace model. So what I mean by that is when I go to assess a student or create an assessment, I want that assessment to match what someone in that discipline might reasonably be expected to do or produce. And I want to be very clear on those expectations. So be very upfront on what the students are expected to deliver in that assessment, and that assessment very clearly matches outcomes that students in those areas would be expected to do should they go on in that field. And so as an example, if you are working in a molecular biology lab, such as this lab, there's probably an expectation that you can accurately and precisely micropipette. And so we try to make that very clear to the students that at the end of the term, you will have to be able to show that skill or demonstrate that skill. So as an example that I have is one of the things we've been working on is kind of a really practical hands-on lab final assessment. And so the focus, this is kind of like in our second last week, and the focus of this assessment is the students are really given 4 activities and they are supposed to manipulate and do those activities. That's very hands-on. So as I use that example, the micropipetting, yes, they're going to need to micropipette. And so how we kind of set that up with clear expectations and give them the resources they need to deliver that is we're very clear on telling the students that by the end of the term, you're going to need to be able to micropipette. And so some of the ways we do that is there's lots of micropipetting in the course. We provide practice micropipetting sessions before this hands-on assessment. So there's kind of like there's time carved out in like the third last lab for students to practice as they so choose to do. And then the other thing we do is we even show them the exam station. So they get to see the equipment and the resources they'll have before they write the assessment. And the reason I kind of frame this all as a workplace model is if you were working in microbiology, no one would hide or expect people to guess what you need to do. You would be told that you need to complete task A, B, and C, and you'd be given a lot of opportunity to learn those tasks and refine those skills before you have to work on it and independently. And so that's kind of where I'm working on. There's work to be done there, but I'm trying to move the assessments kind of in that direction. So those are kind of the big areas that I've jumped in on for the lab. There's work to be done for sure. Kind of moving forward, we want to continue looking at the lab manual and continue revising the lab manual and taking that feedback from students on, how they receive the changes that we're making and see how we can move those changes that are working for students kind of more broadly across the whole lab manual and keep updating that lab manual. I want to keep working on updating and revising these assessments, and providing multiple means of resources to students. So you can kind of think of resources that students traditionally have. And we're really trying to provide those resources for students in a lot of different manners. So like a learning management system, there's resources posted there. We have some videos that Melissa talked about. So students that want to watch videos have that. There's the instructions in the lab manual and the written texts. We have practice questions. We're trying to incorporate some other assessments that model our final assessments in the lab. So we have these concept checks that we use that are short assessments in there. And I think the other big thing is we want to keep updating, adding, kind of increasing access to those videos that are posted on our LMS so students can kind of look at that. So those are kind of where we're at. And I kind of thought right now, though, because I am not an expert in this area, I'm following Melissa's lead here. I'm learning a great deal about this whole area. But I was wondering if we wanted to take a couple minutes here and throw some stuff in the chat about, what people do and ideas that people have, or you can just shout out, and we can kind of maybe I can type a list here on top of the things that we're doing, that if anyone has any great ideas to share on this, that we could kind of pool these things and look at different ways. So I don't know if anyone wants to show some stuff out or pop it up in the text. I realize that this type of activity works best in person, but we're limited to this format. So does anyone have any great ideas that they might want to share? The other thing we can think about too is like challenges, because I have a bit of thoughts on challenges because some of this stuff can be challenging. So if people have questions or want to throw out some ideas on challenges that they might think about, or have questions on how do we do X or Y, I'm open to answering or asking those or answering those questions. Alternatively, we can all just go for lunch, or maybe you're eating it at your desk right now. So,
But I,
oh,
I was just going to say, we'll definitely open it up for
yeah,
questions and comments. But yeah, thank you for the presentation. If that's sort of the end of the
yeah,
sort
like
of
I would just what I
formal.
was gonna say is if we want like like um the challenges, I can share my challenges maybe just to end the thing, that some of the things that I found difficult, and maybe that gives people some ideas, and then we can open it up to questions. So like basic, like quickly what I think, and when I walked into this and trying to learn, I think if you're providing a number of resources, time is always a challenge. I bet you everyone is thinking about how do you have the time to create these resources. I find that now that we're offering a lab manual in two different ways, there's some challenges and hurdles to delivering two different versions, same versions, but different ways for the lab manual. So it's an extra thing to think about. Um, the one thing that I am really always cognizant of is like when we create resources like that lab manual they're showing, and you have very specific diagrams or images of resources that you use, how do you embed flexibility into that in case the equipment that you're going to use that week is not there, or you change equipment, or you have to replace broken equipment. So I'm cognizant of being specific at the same time as being generic, and that's obviously an eternal struggle here. And the last thing is like, I think the challenge, and for me, it's just I'm not an expert in all of these ways. I'll freely admit that I am just not an expert in writing, presenting, creating diagrams, creating videos, creating audio resources. You're not going to be an expert, so I just, I'm trying my best. So those are the ideas that I had.
Yeah, so there's a couple comments. Thank you
Yeah.
so Jacqueline's pointing out that using symbols throughout the lab manual that points students to important safety aspects in a protocol or areas they need to check in with their TA before proceeding. And I think that's great because also I think if you have a symbol, it really separates that from the block of text. And then Carla points out include detailed image descriptions for all students, not just ones with accommodations. And I agree there too, because I think having that image description is great for students who might have visual impairments and need it, but I often think that also it helps clarify what in the image is most important or what they're supposed to be looking at, which I agree is great. And I just wanted to point out, I put a link there, and if in that link that I've provided is some of the resources that the students we worked with created. So Emrys had created a template for the accessible lab design. In order to keep the font the same, to be able to use that dyslexic friendly font, there's also instructions there on how to download that font to your own Word, because if you download their template and you don't have that font, it will just automatically change the font to whatever font it is. So there's that. And then Lauren also put together just some brief suggestions on how to make accessible design accessibly designed videos. So people are welcome to those sources if they want. And yeah, Casey, you absolutely can share that as far and wide as you would like to. So Jacqueline had a question, I think maybe more for you, Mark. Does providing information in multiple formats lead to information overload for students, or does information get missed?
I think that's a challenge. I would agree that's a challenge, but I think that I would guess, and Melissa can comment on this, but I would guess that students are probably leaning towards using the resources that they're most comfortable with. So I think it's about being clear that this is not extra information. This is just the same information in different formats. That's how I would respond to that, but.
Yeah, and I think I would agree. So when we did a bit of an analysis on the instructional videos that Lauren created, which again were not required for students, they were supplementary. So they were on the Meskiness page, and we chose techniques that were likely more newer to students or maybe more challenging, or things that we knew students got a bit confused about in the lab. And I think she made 10 of them, 8 of them, I can't remember right now. When we looked at who were using them, it definitely was not all students. It wasn't like all the students were using them, but we found the techniques that students found most challenging were the videos that were watched the most. And we did find that certain students would watch those videos over and over again. And so again, it might not be something that every single student has to use. They don't all have to learn it in multiple means, especially those students that are more comfortable with that traditional learning approach. But I would say it would be interesting to kind of study this, but there seem to be some students who really do use that. And I would assume if they're watching it over and over again are finding some benefit to it.
I would add to that, like when you're talking about multiple means and presenting information, I would say that don't forget that lab time as your time as an instructor to demonstrate is one of those means. And so when you're designing labs, and that's what I found out going through like recreating and structuring in which activities in this new project we want where, adding time, like you don't have to fill that lab right up. You can add time for students to, extended demonstrations or time at the end that you can walk students through, and your verbal delivery or one-on-one interaction in that space or in your office or office hours is part of that multiple means, because speaking is a different means than reading or looking at diagrams or listening to videos. So
I have a quick question, more about the working with your students to design some of these live activities and things like that. I guess for those of us who have sometimes large teams of TAs that we're having to train when we're delivering the labs and things like that. Have you thought about how like graduate students could be brought in to help with that design purpose or process, and also how you could work with TAs to kind of bring them up to the same page with you guys in terms of um, delivering these kind of inclusive lab experiences.
So,
Yeah, oh, sorry, no, you go ahead. You've worked with
no, no,
TAs.
no. You go and then I'll follow up.
Okay. I was just going to say that I think it would be amazing to also have TAs as part of that team, that kind of co-curricular team, because again, it brings another perspective. And I also want to challenge what Mark has said about like this being me and he's just like on the sidelines. Like none of this would be possible without Mark. Like Mark coming into our team and being such experienced lab educator. I do not, I've taught labs, but that's not my main role. And so Mark has brought such valuable experience, which I would say the TAs would be good as well, because again, TAs also have that recent experience of being a brand new teacher walking into the room and all of the barriers that they experience. And I think sometimes I think that one of the challenges, but in a good way, of like redesigning our lab curriculum is that we have all of these long-term lab instructors. So even if the lab book kind of sucks in places or things are not clear, we have these people that have taught the lab so well and so for so many years, they almost like they already just handle it all because they know what's going to happen. So they know kind of how to communicate to students. And what we're trying to do really is make sure the lab curriculum is robust enough also to stand on its own. So even if a new sessional comes in who's never taught the lab before and they're confused, the lab book is crystal clear for them as well as the students. So I think a TA would be a wonderful addition to this team. And I'll turn it over to Mark, who has way more experience working with TAs.
Oh, yeah, like I would say like TA training is a whole thing. Like I think there's a lot of, I don't want to tout another organization, but I know Able has a lot of resources and there's like a whole silo in Able about TA training that and bringing and proper training of TAs and that is a lot of work. And I think the TAs come from such a diverse background and have such diverse, I guess I would say like thoughts on where they want to be after grad school that some are highly engaged and some are opposite and many are scattered in that middle of that curriculum. So that can be challenging, but I think you can leverage, I would say that you can leverage the TAs that are interested. And when I was in a former role across the river, as a lot of you know, we had a project where we were able to get some money from the faculty to have TAs, their TA-ship was to work alongside the lab coordinator and do design and development. And I think that was an excellent opportunity. And unfortunately, as budgets have become tight in these parts, I think that's gone away. But it's the same structure that Melissa's used for the undergrads here. And I think there's opportunities for TAs to be involved. And I would say that I would agree that TAs, especially the ones that are enthusiastic and want to be there, have a lot of great ideas and can really contribute. And they see things in different ways and they can really contribute to lab design and development. So it's challenging, but I think there's opportunities there.
Thanks. Do we have any other questions for Melissa and Mark?
I had one more if no one else has
Yeah.
anything. So in your comparison of kind of traditional lab manual and then the more inclusive one, I love the addition of all the images and figures and kind of a visual representation of what those words are. And I've tried adding in a similar thing in our manual. And then something I find valuable more from, I think, my perspective, but I've seen it beneficial for students is having them create a flow chart of what the protocol is. And so then in my mind, they're getting to interpret it in the way that works for them, adding figures if they like it, or just kind of rethinking the protocol in a way that works for them. But I've had sort of negative feedback about that too, where students think it takes a lot of time and they don't like it and they'd rather just read the lab manual. So I guess sort of Any tips or advice about doing that, I guess, in a more inclusive way?
I have two thoughts on that. So right now, how what we're using for the pre-labs is like there is kind of that flowchart option. So students before each lab have to upload to our LMS here some sort of recount of the lab, but they can do it in multiple means. So they could give a flowchart, they could do bullet point, they could do an audio file, although so there's lots of things. And then there's a couple questions in there that are really kind of crucial to like, hey, you got to calculate concentration. So you should probably do that beforehand. So there's a small number of those. But I have been thinking about ways to do pre-labs because I think, and I don't want to be that person but I'm going to do it. I'm going to bring up AI right now. I do think that I see a lot when I'm reviewing and I mean, as someone who teaches the lab and reviews these now, you can like, I think a lot of students are copying and pasting the lab manual and getting AI to synthesize something. Right. And so I've been in the early stages of thinking in my head. I haven't told this to Melissa yet, but I've been in the early stages of thinking in my head about redesigning our pre-labs. And that was one of the things that I thought could be useful. Talking with another colleague though, when you do a flow chart, you got to think that it was brought to my attention that there's two different skills there. Are they doing a flow chart to make it look nice and pretty? And is that what they think they're doing? Or are they doing a flow chart like a free flow for learning? And those are vastly two different things. And I think the processes that you use to do those two things are vastly different. So I don't know how you would structure that. And I don't know if Melissa has thoughts on this.
I mean, I don't have so many thoughts, but I'd say from the multiple means perspective, like definitely I like the what is the goal? The goal is that you understand kind of the main point. So a flow chart might be one way you can do it, but what are other ways? And again, I like having the go ahead and do an audio recording if you just want to talk through it or whatever. Um, and I guess one thing I wanted to highlight there is I think sometimes we think where we give students options, if they don't take the options, it's like not worth having it. But keep in mind that part of the universal design for learning is even if only 1 out of 80 students uses the audio, that one student like that make a big difference in their learning because that might really be how they process information. So I would also, that's kind of an aside, but when we're talking about that, I'm like, it's easy to go, well, I give this option, nobody uses it, why bother? But keep in mind that even if it's just one student, for that student, if that student has not had that option in any other class, it could make a big difference. Yeah, students, I don't know. I'm having a bit of a term. I'm having a bit of a term this term with students just really not wanting to be self-regulated learners, like kind of pushing back. And I'm, still wondering it's always like, is this a cohort or is this a trend? And so this is interesting because on one hand, I have second years going like, why do we have to do these little check-ins and whatever? And then I have fourth years who I don't make them do it, who are like, I feel like you should make me do more stuff because I don't want to be independent. And it is interesting. And I think sometimes that comes down to communication. And this is not really so much about what the topic is today, but I do think sometimes it comes down to, oh, I need to take a little bit longer to communicate to them why they're doing this and what the value is for them and their learning. Because I have noticed in some years where students don't like a particular assessment, that then I just take a little bit of time telling them why it's important. And all of a sudden, those complaints disappear from my student evaluations because it's just about telling them why this is good for you. So those are some scattered thoughts. But yeah, I think I'm having these same things like, this is work you should be doing anyway. And as Mark said, if you don't have to make it beautiful, it's literally just like chicken scratch together an outline so I know that this tube is going to go to that tube and that DNA is going to be used next week, then they should know that anyway coming into lab.
Yeah, thank you. I have a lot of the same. It's just balancing everything, but helpful.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Well, I think we're approaching time, so unless there are other last minute questions, I think we can call it there. And again, thank you, Melissa and Mark, for your presentation. It was great. Um, this recording, I think, will be shared on the UBIA YouTube page shortly. I'll make sure that link gets posted. And hopefully you guys can join us for our next Lunch and Learn, which I don't know if we have one in December, but maybe January, I think. Okay. Thank you, guys.
Thanks.
Thanks, everyone.